Hi everyone, I'm Neil, welcome to my workshop. A few weeks ago I made this Kuksa using power tools in my workshop and I really enjoyed the process of making it. So I figured I'd make another one, but this time with a bit of a difference. I'm starting with this piece of oak, which as you can see has quite a big crack in it. Usually this is the sort of thing that would end up in the burn pile or just getting scrapped. I wanted to split the wood along the existing split so as to leave a live edge on it, but something that felt quite organic and natural and wasn't just a big dent. I started off by using the chisel to try and do this, but my concern with the chisel was it was going to end up damaging the wood. So here you can see I moved on to a pry bar that I'm hammering in. It took a fair bit of effort, you can see the wood flexing. And after a bit of persuasion I managed to get it to split along the line that was already there. You can see the crack growing through to the other side there. So as you can see, I was able to get that section pried off and it left me with a nice natural void in the wood that followed the grain lines quite nicely. The plan was that I was going to fill this void with resin, so the next step was to use some packing tape to cover some MFC wood. The packing tape means that the resin doesn't actually stick to it, so you can remove it later on. And having done that, I was able to screw the MFC onto the piece of oak. Now, usually you wouldn't necessarily want to screw into this, leaving holes in the oak, but given I knew where I was going to cut the Kuksa out of this, I knew that there were areas of the wood that it could be sacrificial, that I could lose the screw holes from. So this seemed like the easiest way to get this attached. And with all of the sides attached, I was then able to use the hot glue gun just to seal up in the corners, make sure that there wasn't any gaps that the resin could leak out of. Again, I'm not fussed about doing this on the inside because these bits of it will actually end up getting cut away. I then added some more hot glue to the bottom of it. I was slightly paranoid about the resin leaking out here, so just making sure I went around all of the joins. In the end there was a tiny bit of leak out, but nothing too dramatic. So now it's time to mix up the resin. So I've got a 2-part resin here and I'm just doing small batches at a time. I wasn't quite sure how long it would take to set if I poured too deep. I'm adding some blue dye, and obviously second drip didn't want to go in, but you can't refilm this because once it's in, it's in. It's important with the resin to really mix it thoroughly, make sure that there's none of it left separated, because otherwise it won't set properly. So here we go, the first pour. The first pour I did as just a single pour of 40 millilitres of the dyed epoxy, and then left this to cure overnight. This is typically a 24-hour to 48-hour cure time. 24 hours is fine if what I'm doing is adding the extra resin. That set really nicely overnight, so the next pour I actually did 2 pours at this point, again both of the 40ml because that's the size of measuring container that I have. It was really important at this point to make sure I got the dye exactly the same so that we didn't end up with stripes of colour throughout it, although that could be a nice effect, it wasn't what I was going for here. So I did actually pour 2 sets at the same time here, you'll see it mixing as it goes in, and what I did is made a point of mixing the 2 layers together so that if there was any variance then it would at least blend between these 2 layers. I suddenly realised that I was using up quite a lot of epoxy, and because I was going to hollow this out, actually what I could do is put in a piece of wood in the area that I was going to hollow out, so as to reduce how much epoxy I needed. So I got this in before those second pour layers set. After they'd set and cured, I was able to then add another pour around that piece of wood to fill it in. And then a final pour was needed just to top this up. Shouldn't have mixed up as much epoxy as I did here, definitely had far too much, but I'd rather be on that side rather than ever so slightly too short. I did manage to get this epoxy everywhere trying to do this. It's always a challenge working with smaller pieces. So having let that cure for a full 48 hours to make sure it was solid, I used my Japanese pool saw to trim off the excess of that block that I'd stuck in. It was at this point I realised that that block is actually quite close to the end, which was going to make turning this quite a challenge. I also discovered that screws hadn't been the best idea. These screws were actually completely set in with the epoxy. I think it had leaked into the wood around the screws, and I ended up rounding them off quite spectacularly trying to get them out. This third one, that came out absolutely fine, but the epoxy hadn't got down that far. But as you see, these first two just wouldn't come out. They were, however, the only two that wouldn't come out, so having got them out the other side, I then started off by trying to use a hammer to hit off the side piece, and it wasn't going. So again, knowing that I didn't mind if I damaged the edges slightly because they'd be cut away, I used a chisel and a hammer, and you'll now see a spectacular piece of camera work where I put my arm right in the way of what you want to see. But using the chisel, I managed to get the sides off. Then followed that round with the rest of them, and I ended up actually having to cut the screws that were stuck so that I could get those out. The next thing I did was to take it to the drill press to drill out that piece of wood and to get the bulk of the hollowing done. Now I started off with a 60mm Forstner bit, which is what I wanted in the end, but the Forstner bit was struggling a bit and I was conscious of how close to the edge I was and didn't want it to split. So this, with all the beautiful curls, is when I moved down to a 40mm bit. I then used a Sharpie. You can't really see it too well, unfortunately, but used a Sharpie to mark out the shape of the Kuksa that I wanted to cut. And using the Kuksa that I made in previous video, the link's up at the top there, I actually used that to get a guide for the handle because I really liked the handle. I ended up with that. I used the bandsaw, and as you can see I'm pretty much maxing out my bandsaw here to cut out the blank so that we were roughly at shape. This obviously is the bit that if you were making a Kuksa traditionally would take a long time with a knife. So having cut the blank out, I was able to use the hole that we drilled to mount it onto my lathe and to turn a tenon on the bottom for it to hold. Now I was really paranoid when I was tightening this onto the lathe that I didn't want to split the resin, and unfortunately I didn't actually tighten this on far enough. I should have tightened it more, as you'll see now. I'm quite impressed that that didn't actually break it up when it was coming off. So having finished turning off the tenon, I then locked it onto the lathe and absolutely swung on the key to make sure that it was tight. It's always better with things on the lathe to be holding a tenon rather than trying to put the jaws into a recess. I then went back to the 60mm Forstner bit, but using the chuck attachment on my lathe, and was able to finish hollowing out the centre the way I wanted it. The next thing to do was to go back to my carbide turning tools to round out the bottom. The Forstner bit obviously leaves a central hole. I also wanted to just curve the bottom to match with the curve I was going to put on the outside. Then also using the diamond carbide tip to just smooth off those edges, to take off any rough marks from the Forstner bit. Took the opportunity while I could to get some sanding done on the inside of this. Obviously I couldn't sand the outside because of that handle flying around at speed, but I was able to get some decent sanding done inside the Kuksa, which just helps at a later date. So the next thing I did was take it over to my belt sander. Now my belt sander has a nice function where you can actually clamp it upside down, and as you can see I've zip tied my dust extraction onto the end there to suck away some of the dust that this was kicking up, but it was still definitely a full PPE moment. Masks, glasses, ear defenders. I'm able to use this belt sander to shape the Kuksa as I go around it, and obviously using the flat section gives me the ability to do some nice flats on it, but then as you'll see I just use that roller at the end to get into the concave sections, get some nice curls there. A lot of what I'm doing here is trying to make the wall of the Kuksa even, to make sure that it's symmetrical the whole way around. One of the interesting challenges here is that the resin and the oak sand at a different speed, so actually the sandpaper goes through the resin a lot faster, so I was just having to make sure that I was putting even pressure on and making sure that I wasn't putting too much pressure on the resin section. I'm using the belt sander here to just shape the handle As you can see, the rolling action on it adds a really interesting detail shape onto the bottom of it there. The next thing I did was to take my Dremel, it's Dremel 4000 that I use, and just using smaller sanding discs to just clean up the edges. Obviously there's a limit to the fine detail that you can carry out with the big belt sander. Perhaps whilst you're watching me sand, your cursor could drift down to the subscribe button at the bottom. I'd be very grateful. The next thing I did was to drill some holes in the handle. I really like the handle shape that I ended up with, but it was a bit too heavy, a bit too bulky. The holes also allow for things like lanyards and the like to be attached. You'll notice here that I'm drilling partway from one side, partway from the other, and then finishing off from the other side again. That's to stop me ending up with tear out of the wood from the back. I'm also resting this on a piece of wood so as to get me a nice level surface. Unfortunately, after I drilled this hole, the camera decided it was going to stop recording for this section, so you'll see in the next shot that there are more holes in it that you see me drill, but the process was exactly the same, just with different sized bits. So then it was time to go on to some hand sanding. The belt sander leaves all of the scratches in a single direction, and the 120 grit on the belt sander obviously isn't a high enough finish. I ended up sticking on a podcast, sitting at my desk, and working my way through several grits, starting off with a 180. Obviously the majority of the sanding had been done at 120 already. The idea here was to make sure that there weren't any prominent scratches in the epoxy, but also not forgetting the oak, making sure that it was nice and smooth as well, no tear out. You can see here I'm working my way up, and I actually worked my way all the way up through to 600 grit. I'm then using a brush just to make sure I get all the dust off it, so there's nothing that's going to get set in when I finish. And here it is hung from the roof of my shop, and I'm going to spray some finish on. This is just a clear spray finish. It's a gloss finish so as to give a nice shine to the epoxy and also to the oak. In the end I ended up doing a total of 6 coats of this. Obviously where the string is wasn't going to get any, so each time I did a new coat I'd move the piece of string so that at most there were sections with one less coat than anywhere else. The beauty of hanging it from the ceiling is that there's no edge that has to sit down onto the desk, so I was able to get all the way around, and you can see how that resin just comes to life as the spray goes on. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please click subscribe below, hit the bell so you know when my next video out. Like, comment, share and all those good things, and I'll see you on the next one.